Good evening, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Thank you so much for joining as we are about to discuss a very important topical matter. And this evening, we are going to talk briefly about a recent article that I just read from the Dominican Today. And the Dominican Today is an online Dominican newspaper. And when I say Dominican, I'm not talking about Dominica. That is an Anglo Is it an Anglo-speaking Caribbean country? Yes, even though they speak also French-based Creole. But yes, I'm speaking about the Spanish-speaking country of the Dominican Republic, right? La República Dominicana, right? And for those of you who do not know, yes, the Dominican Republic is a republic, right? It's the Republic of Dominica, La República Dominicana, right? The Dominican Republic. So in that newspaper, this online newspaper that is actually written in English, we have to really congratulate the Dominican Republic. They do have a number of what we see now, newspapers, right? Online newspapers and also printed newspapers, and which produce sometimes some good news. Now, let's look at the Dominican Today. And this article is titled and it's posted today, June 3rd, 2024, proposal for mandatory voting, right? And this caught my attention, of course, when I see the word mandatory voting, right? And you know what we had some years ago, what was mandatory, right? But so the National Congress that's the National Congress of the Dominican Republic, is currently reviewing a new bill proposing mandatory voting in municipal, congressional, and presidential elections held every 4 years in the Dominican Republic, right? So this is interesting because mandatory would mean that every citizen that is eligible to vote will have to vote or must vote, right? Because a mandate is that you are compelled to do what the government or whatever authority tells you to do, right? And this is something that's interesting because we know that in a democracy, one should exercise his franchise, but he has a right or to do it, to exercise it or not to exercise it. But it seems to me that the Dominican Congress, that's the Dominican National Congress, is pushing towards having people do it because they are complaining, as it were, that many people are not voting, okay, or they have abstained from voting. And that is a problem throughout the Western Hemisphere. I'm not sure if it's in other parts of the world, like in India, right, and the eastern part of the hemisphere, but we do know that in Western countries, including the United States and Europe, people are exercising this sort of skepticism, right? They are demonstrating skepticism about their politicians and their political leaders. And as a result of that, a lot of people are abstaining from voting, right? You have what you call voter apathy that many countries are talking about. And our leaders seem not to be doing any robust research in terms of finding out what are the reasons for which people do not have interest in voting. Why are they abstaining from voting? That is not what they're doing. What they're seeking to do, it seems, well, I shouldn't say they, but at least the Dominican Republic. And sometimes when it happens in the Caribbean, it's just a testing ground for what will happen in the entire world, right? So this is something that we have to be looking at. Let me see if I can give you some further information. This initiative, introduced by Deputy Hamlet Melo, representing the province of La Altagracia for the Fuerza del Pueblo party, aims to address the high levels of electoral abstention and prevent the consolidation of authoritarianism in the country. So this bill seeks to prevent the consolidation of authoritarianism in the country. What I think it is saying here, though, is that if you do not force people, if you do not compel them to vote, then you might have the incumbent government who will have access to more political power, financial, what should I say now, wealth, if it were to, to buy votes or do whatever they can, and they will remain in power, right? So this is what perhaps they are thinking, right? That if you do not compel all members to vote, all citizens to vote, then you'll have just one side of the country voting. And more than likely, particularly what happens in many third world countries, people, people's vote or votes will be bought, right? So that is what perhaps this guy is saying. I'm not sure, right? But you could tell me what you think about that. The proposed bill highlights the significant levels of abstention observed in recent electoral events and asserts that all legal age citizens should be obligated to vote. To enforce this legislation, the proposal suggests that the Central Electoral Board, that is the Junta Central Electoral, establish necessary mechanisms for accessible voting centers, implement electoral registration systems, and provide continuous civic education to educate citizens about their voting duty. And that can be done. I think that that's a responsible mechanism, responsible undertaking. However, I do not think that government should have the right to coerce, to compel people to vote, right? Because people should vote on issues, vote on policies. And if governments are not implementing sound policies that will impact positively people's lives, then I'm not sure that people are going to be obliged, they're going to feel obligated to casting their votes, right? So I think that politicians need also to fulfill their obligations to citizens and not just think that our democratic rights include voting, and after votes or after the votes have been cast, everything ends, right? And everything ends there. And I think that's what happens in most Western democracies right now. Democracy is just built on a system of preparing us to vote for the next election, right? It's not about building systems so that people can feel comfortable and that they can feel that their desires and their goals and their needs are being met, right? That is not what it seems that it is about, and we have to be careful of that. Now, the paper continues here. If approved by both congressional chambers, the Junta Central Electoral, that's the electoral agency, would be tasked with creating a registration system containing the names, addresses, and identity numbers of citizens who voted and those who did not. Right? So this is almost like a surveillance mechanism in which the government will be surveilling its citizens to see whether or not they vote. I am not sure if there will be any form of chastisement or castigation. I don't know, but this is very interesting, right? Very, very interesting. And those of us who are prophecy students, right, particularly of Daniel and the Revelation, we know that one day we are going to have the mark of the beast. And this is not anyway distant from what that ideology will be about, right? That what not only ideology, because that ideology will be practiced, right? That those who do not receive the mark of the beast should be punished, right? And how will they do that? They have to have you in a system, and they will have to be able to, you will be tracked by your government. Something that is interesting. I'm not saying now that this is what the government is doing, right? But these are the infrastructures that will be built. And when that system comes into play, when the mark of the beast comes into play, then you know that they will be ready to do that. Arguments supporting the bill emphasize that increased electoral participation would lead to more equitable and diverse representation to legislative and executive bodies, accurately reflecting the popular will and promoting the inclusion of all voices in the political process. Now, our politicians like to talk about inclusion and diversity, right? And yes, we believe in that. I believe thoroughly, and I think most citizens would believe in that we should include as many voices and as diverse voices or diverse voices in our political representation. But when we think about it, it includes much more than voting, right? It includes definitely that, you can see that the policies that have been implemented are impacting positively on people's lives and that they are content. I'm not saying that people are going to be rich and they are going to have a happy time living in paradise, because this world is not paradise, and sometimes we'd like to make it that way. And our politicians also demonstrate and they showcase this world. Oh, when they get into power, they are going to make us live in paradise. It's not a paradise, and and thankfully some people are living comfortably, but for the most part in this country, many people are not living comfortably. The fact of the matter is that I think that the government needs to sit down with the citizens and to discuss ways in which the citizens can participate in terms of lodging their complaints and also making their suggestions, recommendations to how systems can be improved on and their lives can also be elevated. So I think that this is what the government needs to do. You can't just think that because people are going to cast their votes, it means that they are going to be lending their diverse voices, because just casting your votes afterwards and then the government officials do what they want to do, that really is not 100% democracy. In fact, it's just like getting into a marital relationship, going to the ceremony, getting married, and you're going into you're singing your songs, and the pastor officiating that marital vow. That is the beginning of the marriage relationship, the marital relationship, right? It includes much more. Afterwards comes the heartaches and the relationship problems, right? And having children and the responsibilities that go with that, right? So just going to marry, right, in a church does not mean, therefore, that that's the end game, right? There are lots of other things. It's just the beginning of the process. You've just begun a very difficult and happy, can be happy, but also it's a difficult process, right? And people who are married can attest to that fact and that reality. Deputy Melo contends that mandatory voting would foster greater democratic participation, with all citizens actively contributing to the selection of their representatives, thereby enhancing the legitimacy of elected governments. Furthermore, proponents argue that mandatory voting would combat political apathy and electoral abstention by establishing a legal mandate for participation in elections. The bill also suggests that political consensus within the National Congress would be strengthened through mandatory voting, as all party groups and sectors would be incentivized to seek shared solutions for common issues. Thought that was interesting, and I thought I'd share that with you, because what if they should implement mandatory voting in your country? How would you respond to such a policy? Would you agree with them? Would you think that mandatory voting is something that will strengthen democracy and strengthen our freedoms, or do you think that it will impinge, it will restrict our freedoms? Something that you have to think about, because make no bones about it, not because this is just a suggestion, a recommendation that has been put forward in the Dominican Republic, it doesn't mean, therefore, that it cannot get to your country, right? Because we're seeing where governments are behaving similarly, and they are adopting similar policies around the world, right? And it is not surprising, or perhaps it will not be surprising, if this same policy or suggestions or policy recommendation will get to your country, will arrive at your shore. And what will you do? What will citizens do when they are forced, when they are coerced, when they have to vote, right? When it's made mandatory, right? When that mandate shall be declared. What sayest thou when that happens? How shall you stand, as the song says, on that great day, right? When your governments will tell you that you have to vote. It is mandatory, right? Something that you must do and you have to do. And I'm sure that by now citizens in the Western world know that that is not something that is unforeseeable or unthinkable. Maybe before 2021, that would have been unthinkable in many people's eyes, particularly those of us who live in the Western world, right? But now, having passed through 2021 and beyond, right, we now know that that might be a possibility. And the Dominican Republic, you have to say, has fairly, well balanced and established democracy. I think that in their last elections, which were held two plus weeks ago, I think based on what I read from their major newspaper listing diario, I think that over 8 million people were placed on the voting list to vote. They were eligible to vote, or they had signed up to vote. That was my understanding. Out of the 12 million people, 12 million people that live on the island, right? You have over 8 million people that were eligible and had signed up to vote. I thought that for democracy, that was fairly good, because I think compared to other countries, I think you have lower voter turnout. Now, the fact that they're on the list, I don't know if they went out to vote. Perhaps they didn't. Maybe out of that 8 million, I don't know how many actually cast their votes in the last elections. So it is something that I wanted to just put to the fore to allow you to think. Remember now that this is a thinking channel, and I thought that this is something that we need to look at and we need to explore. Would you be willing to have your governments? Well, I don't think that you have any choice. If the government decides that that is what it's going to do, um, that is what it's going to do, right? Because if the Congress passes this law, because it's now a proposed bill, it doesn't mean that it will pass through the National Congress here in the Dominican Republic. But if it is passed, and if let us say that this same policy recommendation gets to your country, how would you feel? And it is passed also in your parliament or in Congress. How would you feel? How would you react? That's something that you need to think about, and I'd leave you to think about it. Thank you so much for joining. It was a great pleasure interacting with you tonight. I hope that you will have a great night and look forward to seeing you in the next video. Remember now to like and to share and to subscribe. Adios.